All right, it is 7 p.m., so I'm going to get us started. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here. My name is Babiak. I'm the program director for the Writers League, and I just have a few announcements before we get into today's event. But first, a couple reminders when using the chat box. Remember to select everyone before sending your message. You also have the option to turn on closed captions for this event, so you can enable those by turning on the live transcript. And if you have any questions for us that you want to be sure we answer, drop them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of this. So first up, if you're not familiar with who we are, we're the Writers League of Texas, and we are a member-based organization. We offer all kinds of support for writers, and if you want to see more events like this one, or if you want to get a bunch of benefits with our membership, definitely consider joining today. All right, and this Saturday, we have the next installment of our 2023 Agent Symposium. Seth Fishman with the Garnered Company is going to be presenting on between signing and submission, the agent-author relationship. And so it's just $25 for his presentation. He'll be in conversation with WLT's Executive Director, Becca Oliver, and then we'll do an extended Q&A. So if you are curious about what goes on between an agent and their author, this is going to be a presentation that you don't want to miss. And we are already excited for next month's third Thursday as well. So on June 15th at 8 p.m. CDT, we're going to be talking about the author-editor relationship featuring author Catherine Center and Jennifer Enderlin, the president and publisher of St. Martin's Publishing Group. So this is going to be a really cool conversation moderated by WLT's Executive Director, Becca Oliver. And they're really just going to talk about how these two people work together to bring a book into this world. So if you're curious about that process, you can RSVP on our website. And we also recently just announced our 2023 Summer Writing Retreat. And so it's kicking off on July 10th, and it is a month-long virtual program. If you want to hone your craft, we have 3 classes as well as a right-away option available. So you can spend an entire month with one instructor, either talking about memoir, fiction, or revision, or you can join us for our right-away option, which really just provides you accountability and a space to write with us and get as many words in as possible. And there's a lot of other things involved. So everyone who signs up for the Summer Writing Retreat also gets access to some lunchtime meetups. You get to join us for our Saturday craft seminars, which are going to be on July 8th and 29th, I believe. And it's just going to be a month full of just like craft and inspiration and community. And it's always a really great time. So definitely check that out. And we have partnered with Book People for this event. So if you have not bought and read this wonderful book already, definitely do so. You'll not only be supporting Deborah, an incredible author in this wonderful book, but also an independent bookstore, which we always want to support. So definitely check that out. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause for the recording. Welcome everyone to WLT on the Craft of Writing, Myth and Memory, staking out new territory in the memoir form with Deborah D.E.E.P. Mouton. My name's Babiak. I'm the program director for the Writers League, and I'll be moderating part of this conversation. But just to give you an idea of what's going to happen tonight, we're going to begin with a talk from Deborah on this topic, and then we'll be in conversation together, and we'll end with the Q&A. So there is lots happening today. Thanks so much for being here. Okay, and so to introduce our panelists for tonight, Deborah D.E.E.P. Mouton is an internationally known writer, director, performer, critic, and the first Black Poet Laureate of Houston, Texas. She's the author of the 2019 poetry collection Newsworthy, which was a finalist for the Writers League of Texas Book Award and honorable mention in the Summerlee Book Prize. Her poems have garnered her a Pushcart nomination and been translated into multiple languages. She's been a contributing writer for Glamour, Texas Monthly, Muzzle, and ESPN's The Undefeated. Her work ranges from writing stage plays and librettos for operas such as Marian's Song to storytelling through film. She currently resides in Houston, Texas. Thanks so much for being here, Deborah, and I'm going to pass it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you for having me. I wish I could see everyone's little unique faces because it's hard on Zoom to like connect, but I'm really excited to see you all and to see you even in the chats, just saying hello and introducing yourselves. My name is Deborah D.E.E.P. Mouton, and as has been said, I'm also going to take a big breath and slow down. It's been kind of a crazy road lately, and I've been working a lot. And so I'm just happy to like put my feet down in this virtual space with you all, take a big deep breath, and talk about the work that I did with this memoir and just my work and how I go about constructing something brand new. I think I've been in love with hybridity for much longer than I can remember. I rarely write things that live inside boxes. I think that somewhere in between is a much more unique space. I started off as a poet, even though I was writing stories at a young age and songs at a young age, but I would have called myself a poet much younger than all of that. And so, constructing poems in journals and things like that, just to rant about my siblings and my parents and how much they annoyed me, was my starting point. And then I built into performing live in poetry slams in high school, and then competing on national levels and international poetry slams as an adult. And so I really did live a whole career that was on stage as kind of the voice of the work that I was creating. And so when I came to publishing, I wanted to try to figure out, how do you go about bottling a performer on page? How do you go about holding the integrity of so many thoughts, so many things that I could physically do with my body, right? I could sing, I could, make beats on my body, I could make sound and onomatopoeia. And there was so much that just doesn't translate to page. And so for me, then the space to play with form, genre, where does poetry enter and exit in prose, the place to build new things, started to be something that I kind of became a trademark to who I am as an artist. And so Black Chameleon for me is one, my first memoir. Yay for the memoir form. For all those of you who are all writing, that you're writing your memoirs and books, I'm amazed by you, because it took me a long time to come around to this form. Um, but for me, coming into the memoir form, coming into prose in general, has been a really unique journey, because for so long of it, I lived in stanzas and lines. And so when I wanted to approach the story, I wanted to think about a lot of things. Number one, I was really in love with the women in my family. My mother, my grandmother, even my aunts would tell me these stories about these wildly rebellious women that all kind of mothered my bloodline, and the things that they would do. These unfortunately were not women that I was ever able to meet because I was not born yet, but the stories were the ones that the women in my family held on to for so long. And I wanted to create something that honored those moments and memories. I also had recently lost my grandmother, and the idea of being able to hold on to stuff that was specifically about her line, was really, really present with me. I was one of those people who spent many an hour on ancestry.com clicking the little leaves, trying to find where I came from and who my people were. And like many Black people, I found that it could only go back so far. I got to 1861 before there was no more leaves to click and no new ones coming, which all those people who have studied history know that's right about the time of enslavement. And that is probably why my family in Tuscaloosa, Alabama disappeared. And so I wanted to think about, how do you go about filling in the gaps of stories for people who don't exist anymore? That idea was a jumping off point for me. It was a place to think about giving myself permission as a writer to fill in the gaps of stories I don't know. But it also made me start to think about the memories of the things I did remember. And thinking about those, memories get kind of hazy sometimes. Sometimes the floor is carpet, sometimes the floor is wood. Sometimes the house is made of brick and it's all the way at the end of the street. And sometimes when I think back on it, my perception as a child moves that house a lot closer than maybe it was. And all of those things served as nuances, and also like almost a multiverse of where a story could live. That all of those things were true. I could both remember it as the giant home that I grew up in, and I could revisit it as an adult and it could be a 2-bedroom home. And those both held a certain kind of truth. And so I started to collect these stories, and I'm going to read a little bit from the book. I'll read kind of 3 passages I have marked. 2 are shorter, 1 is longer. And I'll kind of do that interspersely as I talk about my process. So the first section was actually one of the first stories I wrote. I did not know that it was going to become this book. I actually wrote it and published it in a journal that came out as just a short story. I think it was a bit of microfiction or micro nonfiction, and published it there. I didn't know that I was going to continue to write these things and collect these moments, but I knew this moment was important to collect. And it's a story that my mother told me when I was younger. My favorite truth happened long before I can remember, but my mother does. And if you have the book, I'm on the bottom of page 12 because people like to read along. The way she tells it, it was during the swelter of an Alabama summer. Medea, who raised my mother as her own, held her by some wing. They fluttered into Crest, a 5-and-dime store, something like a Woolsworth. This was back before integration. But the white folks didn't pay them no mind long as they stayed in their own sky. The humidity itched up my mama's throat something awful and left her a wicked kind of parch. She slipped her hand from the nest of swelt building between her and Medea's, flitted over a couple aisles in wonder, and then beelined for the fountain marked white. All the itch still climbing, she transformed into a plumage so vibrant, all the white folks stopped and stared, tracked her with their eyes like they had a pockets full of rocks and a hankering for stoning. To them, she was a leper, and there weren't enough angels stirring in that fountain to heal her from what they were planning. Just then, Medea spotted her, like any mama would, saw them sharpening their tongues on the rocks, made her voice a trumpet to my mama's own rapture, hollered, "Pat, wait!" And my mama froze long enough for them to slide their hands back into their pockets. The corners of their mouths perked to approval. I guess it looked like the wild had learned the rules, like the Jim Crows could check their own chicks. Just then, Medea saw them in all their happy and separate, knew that at any moment they could break her beak for just trying to scratch an itch. She saw my mother's bewilderment and decided to send a stone of her own flying back. "Don't drink out of that one, it's dirty." She pointed to the fountain marked colored. "The clean one is over here." I remember hearing this story about my great-grandmother and thinking, what kind of rebellious woman do you have to be to stand in the middle of the segregated South and tell them that the white fountain was the dirty one in public, right? Some badassery right there, right? It's some confidence right there. And I was like, wow, this is the kind of women I come from. Maybe this is why my mouth is the way that it is. Maybe this is why my confidence sometimes can be what it is. Not saying that I'm always confident, but that there's something in me that always wants to speak out against injustice and always wants to fight for a more equitable world. And I started reconsidering who I was and why I was who I was. They say trauma lives in your DNA, but I think that survival does too. And so for me, these women, the way that they survived was the way that I was learning to survive. And so I got to a place where I had been collecting stories for about 6 months to a year, and I was probably about 100 pages in. It was really feeling good, but there was like this hurdle of a thing that was just like, something is not moving the way I want it to. Something is not more than just a diary of stories. I needed it to be something universal, something transitory. And so I put the book down, which you should always be okay walking away for a little bit and getting some perspective. And I was like, I don't know what this wants to be yet. And this is often a conversation I have with myself. As a multidisciplinary artist, I find that sometimes I will write things in one medium and realize that they need to live in an entirely different medium. I've had poems become plays. I've had poems become arias in operas. I've had arias go down to poems. So I think really listening to the work and giving it what it wants to be, letting it be what it wants to be when it grows up, is an important part of the process. And so I was talking with a former student of mine who'd become a friend, and they had a podcast, and they were doing this great work in collecting mythology from the city of Houston and talking to people about the myths they grew up with. Jackson Neal invited me on their podcast and said, what mythology did you grow up believing? And I just froze. I had no answer. And I sat with that moment thinking, what mythology do I have as a Black American woman And while that's my perspective, I think all of us have identity markers that quantify who we have become, whether that's economic status, social status, religion, race, all of those things complicate us in the most beautiful ways. And so thinking about my position in this body, in this experience, I started to wonder what it would look like to have a mythology of Black American women. And I was like, well, if mythology is a space for origin stories, where would my origin be? Because yes, I am of the African diaspora, but there's something that's never been African about me. I don't know cultural things from any country in Africa, aside from those that I've studied in college or in books. But it's not a lived experience in my body the way that Americana is. But American also doesn't feel quite right because there's an added color to that, pun intended, that says that this existence is more complicated than just being a good old patriotic American. And so I started to think about mythology as a space to interrogate the in-between, a space to give context and understanding to who I had become, a space to explain why Black women are the way that we are, why we carry ourselves the way that we do. And that is an overgeneralization by much, right? We are not a monolith. We have a lot of nuance to us. But there are some things that we hold in our bodies in the same way, or at least ones that I've noticed. And I wanted to start putting something together that explained that for my daughter, explain that for people who have to work with me, explain that for the world that is to come, that is not yet. And so the first myth that I wrote was how Black women got eyes in the back of their head. Right? Very Southern saying that doesn't just apply to Black women, but in my experience, it definitely came from my mother and my grandmother, right? It's like, I'm not going to chase you. I got eyes in the back of my head. I wish you would start something with me, right? And so thinking about what that means to hold sight behind you and hold an ever-present sight 360. What does it mean to see everything? Knowing that there's things that you see that you can't let go of. Right? There's a responsibility. There's also a burden that comes with that kind of sight. And I wanted to play with that. And so I wrote the first myth, and there was this beautiful permission that happened where after reading it, I was like, I feel so much more seen and understood in just the act of creating the mythology. Well, what does that mean for people who are going to ingest it? And I was like, I think I really love the idea of fiction blending in here, of this space of like, I love Greek and Roman mythology, and there are people who will fight you down that Poseidon isn't real, right? And this idea that mythology lives in this space of it could have been true, where fiction is just assumed as it never was. Mythology does something different. So I started to hold that and think about building that as a conceit in this book, that there would be moments where mythology would enter to give understanding and context and clarity. But that conceit quickly fell apart because I realized that the mythology didn't live separate from the memory. But those colloquialisms, those sayings from my family, they were the fodder for my understanding of self. And they blended with my experiences to be who I am. So I'm getting ready to read another section for you. It's on page 92 for those people who have the book. And I heard this troubling statistic, which is that women are their most confident at the age of 10. And I sat with that and I was like, what kind of dark world do we live in that is the truth? But then the more I thought about it, I started thinking about what happened to me at 10 that would have moved the needle on my confidence. And it didn't take long for me to stumble on the incident that I recount in this story. But for me, there also was this thing of saying, if I'm going to retell this story, this one that shapes and shakes my confidence, do I still have to remain the victim? Or do I get to rewrite a new ending within mythology that gives an understanding of who I have become, and an understanding of who we become in instances like this? So I was 10. Entering the doors of a Starburger after my mother lifted the ban on eating there due to their support of apartheid. She said we wouldn't support racism. I just wanted my waffle fries. Once Nelson Mandela made his way home, we sat under the single smiling star pulsing in a strip mall in the desert. Happy to be back to order our bacon Western cheeseburgers and the crunch of perfectly fried potato hashtags. There was a long line when we arrived. My brother and father told my mom their orders before slipping out the back door to the patio to hold our table. I danced eagerly, sliding my body under and over the chain link divider like it was a game of Chinese jump rope I just couldn't kill. My mother tried to reel in my body from bumping into other patrons. She reminded me that we were not born from grace. Maybe the child had not fully left my body, but I was twice the size I should be, an emerging town home in my mother's eyes. I wanted so much to find my own gangly independence, and my mother felt me pulling. So once all was paid for, she tasked me with holding the plastic tit number and waiting by the long bar under the pickup sign for our order. She joined my father and my brother outside where the sun was just warm enough to cut the chill of fall. I danced around, imagining that the floor was made of lava, that the black tiles fell into a helpless abyss, and the white tiles held the safety of shaky cliffs. I fed the Tamagotchi that Monique gave me in one of our rare interactions, even though I never wanted to play mother prematurely the way she and T had, both becoming parents before gaining graduation caps. I was still a child myself. I played a dozen songs in my head and sang them all backward, and the wait seemed endless. They eventually called my number. There were 2 trays of drinks for 4, but I was sure my mile-long arms and flat chest would serve me well. I balanced the trays on my forearms and the drinks triangled together between my fingers. Then I started my approach toward the glass door in the back. People watched in awe as step after step the cups of orange soda and cola sloshed back and forth but never tipped. All were so impressed that no one offered to help. Not the freckle-faced employees, not the mother with 3 kids of her own screaming for them to stay in their seats in the back corner. Not even the man who watched me the entire time I was in line creating my own dance club. I noticed him when we first walked in. He sat alone at a table near the door reading his paper, glancing up occasionally and then quickly disappearing behind the text again. He was enamored with me, each stare longer than the last. By the time the fries and drinks joined my act, he was entranced with my off-kilter teetering. I made my way toward him. I could see my family on the back porch under the metal umbrella's red and white sanctuary. I shifted and shifted as I tried to find a third hand to push the bar door open into the fall air. Any extra appendages, prehistoric relic members, then an idea. I turned my back around and hurled my butt into the bar, sending the door flying into the wind. As it opened, the crowd seemed unmoved by all my quickening genius. All but the paper man by the door, who folded back the entertainment section and howled, "So that's what all that ass is for." Loud enough for the entire restaurant to stop and examine all my 10-year-old Hottentot exotica. I cut my eyes hard at him, the way my mom did the first time I said a curse word in front of her. Hard enough to make the room begin to shake. His body gave over into violent convulsions. The families at the tables around him began snatching their children close. His hands radiated, his chest bulged, the ceiling fought to hold his rising back. By now, the nearbys had taken the full sprints. Then his face was peeled away, and before me stood Akarema, the greatest warrior spirit. Born of a restless death devil, he made the brown projects cower with his white gaze. The strength of 12 settlers in one hand and the brawn of 4 grandmothers who won their rounds with death in the other. The star-spangled Spitfire soul slayer. His legs stretched high and wide, his stovepipe hat splintering through the roof and up to the heavens. He began to violently sling tables and soda machines at the wall. The land before us became a fast food desert. Akarema's sharpened finger, brandished as a sword, won the length of 3 Cadillacs and the sharpness of the crop god's tongues. He pointed at me as if to initiate an ultimate duel. I leapt behind the counter, spilling all the food onto the checkered floor. I made the cashier give me her red hat as a helmet, and I used one of the serving trays as a shield. Akarema, like the legend says, alternated finger slices and exhales so rancid that he could level an entire army with just the smell of his breath. I'm sorry, can you not understand me? I see a thing in the chat. Oh, okay, awesome. Yes, closed captions are awesome. Sorry about that, y'all. I just want to make sure everybody's with us. I'm back up just a little. Born of the restless death devil, he made the brown projects cower with his white gaze. The strength of 12 settlers in one hand and the brawn of 4 grandmothers who won their rounds with death in the other. The star-spangled Spitfire soul slayer, his legs stretched high and wide, his stovepipe hat splintering through the roof and up to the heavens. He began to violently sling tables and soda machines at the wall. The land before us became a fast food desert. Akarema's sharpened finger brandished as a sword, one the length of 3 Cadillacs and the sharpness of the crop god's tongues. He pointed at me as if to initiate an ultimate duel. I leapt behind the counter, spilling all the food onto the checkered floor. I made the cashier give me her red hat as a helmet, and I used one of the serving trays as a shield. Akarema, like legend says, alternated finger slices and exhales so rancid that he could level an entire army with just the smell of his breath. I held my air and looked for a way to fight back. I searched my pockets but found only a pack of sunflower seeds. They would have to do. I loaded my mouth with a handful and hopped over the pickup station. Akarema saw me and cocked the large blade to come down on me, but I was too fast. The patting of my hips softened the slide as I glided across the floor and waited for my moment. Akarema inhaled deeply to power a deadly belt, and I machine gun spat every last seed from the barrel of my mouth. Most missed, but one arched with perfection and landed in the slack-jawed mouth of Akarema. Instantly, he knew what I had done. The salt from the seed spread across his tongue and down the backside of his throat until a cough ensued. He tried to drown it out by slurping the exploded soda from the seed that had formed near the entrance, but that only made the seed hungry for soil. Within seconds, Akarema felt the roots protruding from his stomach, up through his lungs. Desperate to stop the spread, he charged through the wall and turned the restaurant into rubble. He began to grab clumps of parking lot, swallowing the rocks that tumbled down from the nearby mountains. In the hope that they would bury the sprout that now leafed polyps from his nose and sought to invade his head. He swallowed more and more until he fell to the ground, too heavy to fight. Akarema tried to claw the plant out. He thrashed about, destroying cars and buildings. I knew he wouldn't stop until it was free or everything around him ceased to exist. I did what I had to. I bent Akarema's long finger back with both hands until it broke free. Then I approached, swinging it as high and as hard as I could. It landed in the middle of his lips, cracking his skull from jaw to crown, bursting the polyps, but there was no blood. Instead, doubts, like a horde of horseflies in incantation, filled the sky above Akarema's ruptured head. Looking for noses to invade, they found me, and I was not light enough to fly away. So for me, I decided that there was a unique space I could hold, one that held Blackness and the African diaspora and the idea of oral storytelling and the idea of a griot, right, that carries the stories in their bodies and that tells you, what the history of their people is. And there was a space for Americana, which I will argue is often revisionist history. You can be mad about it. It's okay. I think of things like Paul Revere, which we later learn was not, he was like I think a prisoner that was running away. Just this thing that was not what we expected it to be when we first heard the story. But that there was a space where America loves and knows how to rewrite their history in the most glorious and magnificent endings. And if I am a both Black and American woman, then there is space for me to do both, to create this mythology that's deep and rich and founded in the South, and especially as a motherland for Black people, specifically post-enslavement, and to create these brand new mythologies that wrapped up my current existence. So there's a section about what happens when your edges get snatched, right? That's very colloquial and very right now. There's a section that talks about Boo Boo the Fool, who, if you know Black culture, it's someone we always refer to, but no one knows the story of how she became so foolish. And so thinking about how I tap into culture and reframe it for myself was an exercise that brought much joy. And while it was just fun to create, I found something else happening. There was a moment where I'd lost a friend of mine. I had lost my sister, and I was approaching a myth. Let me back up. I was in Chicago. I was talking to a friend of mine, Jarvis, and we were sitting outside the Poetry Foundation, which is this beautiful kind of concrete garden area, but there's, butterfly plants and stuff around. And the monarchs were coming in, and they would come and land on Jarvis's skin and fly away. And he told me, he's like, in Mexican culture, that is your ancestors visiting you. And I was like, how beautiful to think about yourself having this tie to nature in this authentic, original way. And I was instantly jealous because I was like, for as a Black woman, I don't know that I've ever been allowed to feel that close to nature, to feel intentional about my existence here. It's always been as a byproduct of violence, as a byproduct of someone stealing me from my home and bringing me to these lands. And I wondered what it would be to create a myth that connected us back to nature. And so I started thinking, if there was a bug that was going to visit us or an animal that visited that represented Black culture for me, what would it be? And I landed on the cicada, right? I was like, we love to eat. We make a lot of noise sometimes. I can say this because I'm Black, right? My brother, I thought about him devouring food, right? That's so much so that we would have to hide food in Tupperware containers under our beds to keep him from eating all the snacks, that there was always this laughter that resonated from the women in my family, so much so that the men in our family would sneak to the back bedroom at Christmas time because the women would become so loud that they're like, we just need to escape the amount of laughter here. And I was like, okay, so if I'm going to create a cicada myth, what does that look like for us? And I created a myth in the book that talks about, when our children go missing, that death turns them into cicadas and gives them a new life, and that they're birthed into the trees, and the sounds that we hear is our children coming back to us and resonating back to us. And I stepped outside for the first time after writing that myth, and it was summertime, and the cicadas started to sing. And I remember turning to the trees and just saying my sister's name and everything going silent. And I wasn't loud, right? And then almost one by one, the cicadas slowly started to build back into song. And while I don't know that that's the truth, that there's some reincarnation that happens in cicadas' lives, there was an ultimate peace that came in thinking that the proximity that I have to my lost loved one was right there, right? Ever present, was loud in the summertime, was ruckus and, really close to me. There was something just really beautiful about it. And I thought to myself, this is the power of mythology. It is that we get to create a story that never dies, that we get to immortalize ourselves in a tale, in artwork, right? We see statues of mythology all around Europe, and that there's something about giving yourselves over to a tradition that can never forget when you have always felt like a forgotten people. So the last section for me was kind of my arrival at understanding that, right? That there's like something beyond that works as reclamation and as a space of belonging that mythology can usher me into, that can work side by side with my memories and my memoir building, but that can move the needle beyond just telling a good story into a space where I could reckon with things of myself and come to a new understanding of who I was in this world. This is page 292 if you're reading along. We must remind ourselves who we are, for God will soon forget their power without a believer to remind them what they have survived. And a believer must have something to praise, lest they hold too tight to false doctrine. I have always thought I was meant to be more. As a young girl, I equated it with mansions, teeth covered in carats of kimberlite, long limos that stretched for years, the kinds with the funhouse reflections of a slim, happy thing. Then my body learned what it meant to be so ravaged that it sought to hunt itself. What kind of witchcraft says that I have become a washboard, one worn down to music, my bones clanking in the my bones clanking in the bag of my flesh? Is this pleasing to the gods' ears? Is this what you seek to call sacred? I, so small a strong wind could turn me airborne. I spread so thin, burdened with all the feelings at once. No silence to stop them, holding space for 10,000 souls in raw need, in charge of every decision, tasked with everyone's fate. I become death in that moment, one with all the power to choose if I will pass on or stay right here. I want to choose to take off the cloak, to forget every face I have made before, so I can remember the one I own right now. What a notion, to think that we can let go and not fall, that the hands raised to me would be enough for me to stand on, For once, I would be saved, heralded even, for being only who I promised to be, me and myself alone, all Black, all woman, all loved. And so in putting together this book, I knew that the arrival for me had to be in a space of self-love. You know, I can tell you all of the things that have happened to me in my life, and trust me, there has been some things that I would never want to repeat. But at the end of it, I look at the scars on my stomach from having 2 kids cut out of me, right? I look at the scar on my knee from having a total knee replacement 6 months ago. I look at how my body has stretched and ebbed and flows, wrinkles and dents and moles and birthmarks. And I find that all of those things are telltales that I have survived a harsh world and that I can continue to choose joy. And that is something really beautiful in that. The memoir can bring me to a space where I can wrestle with the difficult things and find a way to accept them. And for me, that came right along with mythology. It also came a lot with poetry, right? Of being able to blend the language that has become a language for me, right? And not just something that I express my words through, but my husband will tell you, I fight in poems, okay? We get into arguments. He's like, I can never win because you're always like, and you make me feel like my heart is leaping out of my body. It's always something, right? So thinking about being able to claim all the languages you have spoken, whether it's a foreign language to this country, whether it's a language we speak here, whether it's the language of pain or the language of hurt, whether it's a language of form or poetry or mythology, that all of those things become accessible tools for you as a memoirist writing your story. Because at the end of the day, right, it's important that as we write our stories, we're the ones holding the pen. It's one of my favorite quotes, right? Thinking about how do I hold the pen for my own story. And in this book, I didn't know, I wasn't sure that it would work in memoir, but I did know for sure that these were all pieces of me that formed a greater quilt, that if I could finally put all the pieces together, people would think it was a really beautiful tapestry. And not everyone agreed with the way that I went about writing this book, but at the end of it, they all could kind of see where I was going. And so I think it's really important that you stay authentically true to what you want to create, that you speak your languages, right? That you take whatever pieces of you feel are important to be remembered and to remember, and that you lean into those because that is the way to make really great memoir writing. Yeah. All right, Sam, I think it's time to come back and have a conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. There is so much that you said that I really want to dive into. But let's start just thinking about memoir a little bit more broadly, because we hear memoir and we think nonfiction. We think these are the facts. We think all of this makes this big truth. And so I wondered how you define truth in these pages, because like you said earlier, you were creating myths, and there's so much more going on here than just your own story. And so how did you define truth?
Yeah, for me, truth is subjective. People want things to be black and white. That's not really true. There is a difference between factual and truth. And I think that's one thing I wanted to interrogate, right? I was doing a book reading, and this woman gave a better example than I ever could. So I'm going to borrow her example. But she said that there was this story and a picture in her house of her dad holding this giant fish above his head. And for her whole life, she thought he caught this giant fish. He was a superhero, super fisherman guy, right? Like she was like, it built totally into the mythology of who I believe my father to be. The strong provider who could go out and catch a fish with his bare hands if he needed to. And when she got to be a little older and she was an adult, her mom was like, sweetie, your daddy didn't catch that fish, right? And she was like, honey, the neighbor gave your daddy that fish after he went fishing. And your dad just held it for the picture and then he gave it to somebody else to clean and eat, right? But that like what you remember is this hero of a dad, right? And that picture reaffirmed that thing in you every time you questioned it. You looked at that picture and you said, but my dad can go out and catch a giant fish, so he must still be a hero. There is a truth about that. That became the narrative that then fed everything she believed about her father. Whether that was factual or not, clearly, obviously, right? Those were not the facts, but there was a truth there. that I think that she held on to and that we hold on to. You know, my mother, I knew her to be a certain kind of woman. And no one could tell me differently that my mother wasn't strong, right? No one could tell me different that my mother was not a force. And so everything that I then learned, I attached to that fundamental truth about my mother. And it also shaped how I became the woman that I am. Why I feel like I need to be strong all the time. Why I feel like I have to push through even when I don't feel comfortable pushing through. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, those truths shaped me. And I wanted to focus more on that than worrying about if I got right that she wore a plum dress or a red dress, right? Or if she was in California or in Texas when this happened, because those things seemed like much less important than you understanding the character of the person that I'm giving you, you know? And I think that's how we remember ourselves and how we remember the people around us. So for me, that's where truth sits, is what truth do you need to know in order to understand who and what the moral of the story is, in the greater sense of things. Yeah.
Mhm. I love that so much. And I think when you're writing memoir, you can kind of get bogged down in those little details that you don't necessarily remember, but looking and thinking about the truth in this way is so much more freeing. And so I'm wondering, I believe it's the second chapter of the book where you kind of start out saying, I was not alive for these events, but this is how this story was told to me. And I thought that was just so wonderful because memoir, we think these are our stories, this is my perspective, but you also included these family stories. And so I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about that and also how you sort of navigated writing these family stories that you actually were not a part of, or were a part of, but didn't have like real recollection of?
Yeah, I had to trust the unreliable storytellers of my family. You know, it's funny because now my mom was very big on not wanting to see the book prior to it coming out. She's like, your truth is your truth. I just want to understand how you see the world. And if I taint it by trying to come in and correct things, that's not going to be helpful. And so now she reads the book and she's like, that's not how that happened, right? And I'm like, please don't come in now trying to correct me, right? So it's funny to see that, like, where my mother has an account that something happened one way, my sister's account is very different. And my grandmother's account of the same event is wildly different, right? That each of their perspectives are almost like the 4 books of the New Testament, right? Like they remember Jesus in a very different way than each other. But I think that there's something in there that's kind of like when you have 2 children that are fighting, the truth is in the middle of those 2 stories, right? It's not all person A and it's not all person B, but there's like a lingering through line. And so for me, that's kind of how I navigated thinking about family stories is, what's the through line of who I know these people to be? Does it sound ridiculous for my mom to beat my sister till she's tired? No, it does not. Right? Does it sound ridiculous for my mom to kick my sister out? Absolutely. Right? It's beyond the character I've ever exhibited her. So, maybe sister was lying a little bit there, but there was some truth in their stories. And what were the commonalities in the stories? Maybe that's where the truth lies. So it really was a thinking about collecting all the accounts and then winnowing down to the piece that felt like it hit the most marks. And then in some instances, it was what sets me up for the greatest mythology. Is it the giving in to my sister's most ridiculous story will get me to a greater point later on? Then maybe I'll entertain it for the sake of the story. I think it's that. And it was kind of a beautiful space to not be bogged down by those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my favorite lines from the book actually is, for a story is made equally of the things it chooses to recount and the things it chooses to forget.
Yeah.
And so I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about that as well and how you kind of navigated what you wanted to make sure you recounted in these pages and the things that you decided not to include in these pages.
Yeah, omission is definitely a tool here. But I also think about like when you're around family and you're doing family stories, and there's this moment where like your family member says like, that's how so and so broke their arm, and you're like, that's how that happened, right? Like you're like, wait a minute, back up. That's not how I remember that. That there is like this certain amount of omission that comes in retelling a story over and over and over again. That little bits and nuances and pieces and who's in the room really does shape what that story looks like. And so in some instances, it was thinking through that, right? Of like, what are the fragments and what are the pieces I don't need? In other instances, it really was more curatorial, right? There's a whole section of the book that's centered around the people who have tried to sexually assault me. I chose in that section to not include the moment in which I actually was assaulted, because you didn't really need to know that. You needed to know, I mean, you needed to know what happened, but you didn't need to know all the grisly details. Like, no one really needs that. What you needed to know is how many times my life felt threatened. You needed to know how many times fear lived in my body. You needed to know that there was a pattern, right, of being in danger and fear, that at every turn I was still facing the same thing. Because that, I feel like, is a very woman experience. That's one that we can all identify for. And so I was thinking about, how much do I need to tell you to get you on my side of understanding? And what crosses the line into where it now becomes that you're a voyeur to the experience and no longer in conversation with me? That is a really, really tricky line, but omission definitely played a large part in thinking about that.
Thank you. And I mean, going back just a little bit in this process, I'm wondering how you actually chose like the phrases that you wanted to turn into myths, or the experiences that you wanted to use to sort of create these myths as well. Like, how did you know that there would be something at the end of that thread that you were following?
There was a lot of phrases that started in this book. I'll tell you that. Like, every section, every story had a phrase. And then, so there was the ones that kind of came from my mother, my, women in my family. And then I went and like Googled like Black colloquialisms, because there's some that are based by region, right? So I've lived in California, I've lived in Michigan, I've lived in Texas. If it's not in one of those three, I probably don't know it in my body, right? I might have heard it before, but there was this thing about me wanting to really like cast a wide net and see if there were things that spoke to me even outside of those. So I think one of them was like, a lie, don't know who tells it. And I was like, ooh, you right. People be out here just lying, you know? And so it was a thing of like that there were some of them speaking to me that I was like, when I think of this phrase, I immediately am transported to this memory. Or when I think of this phrase, I start to consider, why I do X action, or why we allow X action. And so it was like, okay, well, if the case is that we entertain terrible lovers because, this greater thought, then maybe there's a way to figure out how to reverse engineer that saying into something that's more meaningful, that gives color to those things. And it was a longer process actually with the mythology than it was with the stories. It was a lot easier just to write memoir straight out than thinking about kind of the pieces that live in the middle. I tell people that there is probably a whole nother half of a book that got axed, that a lot of it is these kind of sayings and stories that I wrote from them. Because when I sat down to do the arc of the collection of stories, it just didn't feel like it pushed the memoir forward. So it was like, while it's an amazing story and you get to know my grandfather, better, or whoever it is, it just doesn't feel like it wants to live here. And I'm willing to say I'll take it out and hope for better, hope for another chance to tell the story at a later time, than forcing it into a space that it doesn't want to be.
Thank you. And so I want to go back to what you were saying about like Googling colloquialisms and all of those things, because I'm so curious about what your research process looked like for this book. It sounds like you had these phrases or things in mind, and then you kind of started thinking about the memories that you had that reminded you of them. But like, what was that actual process? And at what point did you reach out to research or to people in your family to kind of give you more to include?
I think it was less about like reaching out to family and more of kind of like, as I'm writing, my ears just became attuned differently. Like there's always, I guess, at family gatherings, even like I would hear my mom on the phone with my grandmother and like, yeah, that was like when Junebug did that. And I'm like, okay, so let me just listen to this story because it's crazy. And so I would start listening to the world and seeing the world differently. Algorithms are great. So once you Google Black colloquialisms, every Facebook post that has a Black colloquialism starts to trend, right? So it's a lot easier because it's like doing the work for you of populating those things and keeping them present around you. So that was really helpful. But I also wanted to make sure that I was interrogating mythology as genre and form. So what I would do is, on my rides to work, I was teaching at the time, and I had probably about a 40 to 45-minute commute. And I would turn on a podcast called Myths and Legends, and I would listen to the podcast because it had this like smattering of myths and legends from all over the world. And I would dissect them on how they formulated the myths, right? So there was like a lot of African countries leave the mythology up to the listener to come up to the moral of the story. You know, so they say like, was the monkey or the king the most wise? And you're like, I don't know. I think it just depends on how you want to argue this, you know? For a lot of the other ones, they were much more straightforward. A lot of Japanese mythology leans towards agriculture. So you have things like Momotaro, that's the peach boy, that's born, the warrior born from a peach. And so thinking about those as like entry points, right? I was like, oh, I could use agriculture as a birthing place. Bet. I want to take what looks like a Black woman. What fruit looks like a woman? I was like, oh, it has to have hips and curves. A gourd has hips and curves, right? Oh, that actually kind of looks like a Black woman's body. So maybe that is where Black women are born, right? From gourds in a garden somewhere, you know? So it was thinking through those forms also gave me new insight into how do I go about really actualizing some of the mythology. And then from there, sometimes I would have a myth and I'm like, okay, this is teaching me about body autonomy. Oh God, how many times have I struggled with body autonomy? You know? Well, if I'm going to think about myself as a whole human, I didn't learn about my body at 13 or at 10 or whenever my period started, right? Like that was a moment in the learning, but it was not at the arrival. And honestly, if I'm really honest, haven't had an arrival yet. I'm still figuring it out. But what are the steps, the fundamental steps that have contributed to me understanding how to hold the body that I have the way that I do? Okay, I can go about starting to collect some of those ideas and then seeing if there are specific moments that were kind of like tent pegs that I can take you from one to the next to kind of give you a clear understanding of who I've become. So in that way, they were in conversation with each other, kind of guiding me and helping me kind of decide which pieces lived in and out of the book.
Wow, that's incredible. And so I'm sure we have a lot of memoirists and personal essayists in the room here with us. And so I'm wondering, like, what was your process for tapping into your own memories when you were writing this book? Because for some people, it's hard to, place certain things in time, or just like, memories are not always accurate necessarily. And so what did that process look like for you? And do you have any tools or tips for tapping into memories, especially ones of childhood?
Yeah, I think the first part is write what you remember, right? Don't worry about what you don't, right? All the parts you remember first. You may realize that you remember much more than you thought you did. I think also if it includes other people that you have access to talking to them about the moment and it doesn't put you in mental harm to do so, I preface that, right? Because some memories are not happy ones. And the last thing you want to do is be revisiting it with somebody who hurt you. But if you could do it in a healthy way, I think being able to have those conversations. For me, a lot of that was brothers and sisters, right? Being like, you remember that one time where and they're like, oh, do you remember this and this and this? And then they kind of fill in the story. Also for me, best friends were good because a lot of them, for me, I had when I was a child and I've held on to friendships for, 20 years or so. So revisiting things, even with like my childhood best friends, were really great because they would, even if they weren't there at the memory, they remember me telling the memory in real time. So sometimes they're able to give extra insight. And then as far as for me, I try to think in space and time as well. I think location really helps bring out memories in ways that I didn't imagine it would. So even something as visiting old childhood homes or neighborhoods, looking at old pictures always would help because I'm like, who is that? Oh yeah, I did have that one friend, right? That always my mama hated them, being able to, really look at things like that were really wildly helpful in just kind of jogging the memory of those things that happened. And then it came down to really deciding which pieces I felt like moved beyond just me recounting a memory for memory's sake into something someone else can take something from, which I think is like a next level of editing that comes with the work.
Absolutely. Thank you. So to our audience, I'm going to ask Deborah one more question before we move into the Q&A. So start adding your questions to the Q&A box. But Deborah, I was wondering, were there any books or writers that you returned to or that really influenced you in the writing of this book?
Absolutely. So Audre Lorde sits at the very top of that list. Zami, A New Spelling of My Name is a book by Audre Lorde that a lot of people don't know. And it actually started a genre called biomythography, which blends biography and mythology together. So I didn't just create this out of nowhere, y'all. Someone did it way before me. Quite a few people actually did. Maxine King Hong Kingston's, I always mess her name up. Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior did similar work, but with, I believe Chinese culture. Am I messing that up, Sam? Um, and was able to take a lot of Asian myths and blend them into her storytelling. And so while it wasn't a one-to-one comparison to the work that I was creating, it laid a framework and a foundation for the work I wanted to create. I was also looking at Toni Morrison's work and thinking about how the stories played out and the difference between living in the moment of a poem and living in the plot of a story, right? And how she goes about layering those things was really important. Octavia Butler for some of the more crazy outlier stories. And then Inazaki Shange, because at the same time I was writing a choreo poem. And so thinking about how poetry blends itself to movement and blends itself to performance, and where the line is between where the poem becomes the story, becomes the poem again, those things were wildly helpful for me in just crafting this new genre of a memoir.
Thank you. All right, so to our audience, we're gonna head into the Q&A now. So if you have any lingering questions for Deborah, please add them to the Q&A or the chat box. All right, looks like we got one already. When and how did you capture such a command of language and words? I struggle for words and find that I'm in awe of how easily these words flow so gracefully from you. Was this always the case?
Yes, and I think I was always gregarious, as one of my teachers called me in his recommendation, right? Which is like, I just talk too much. That's all it really means. I think so. I've always had a love of language. I started reading when I was like 3 or 4 years old. And so reading for me has been a huge source of that kind of vocabulary bank, right? Of, I think the more that I read, the more that I hold on to. I'm definitely the reader that gets to a word I don't know and then immediately looks the word up instead of skipping the word like a lot of people do. And so I'm looking to kind of be that collector of words. And that's been a lifelong thing. So I think there's a portion of that. I also love a good what's a synonym for on Google. It's great. It's helpful. It makes it means I don't say jelly 700 times and instead I say jam, right? Some things just need something else. I also think that learning Spanish really helps me with words. And I say this because not just because it opened me up to a whole nother language of words, but one of the first things they tell you in learning a foreign language is when you don't know the word, describe what the thing does, right? You don't know what trees is. So you're just like wood that grows leaves, right? So then it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to take that as a poet, I can say the woody leaf thing, right? Like, or the leaf of wood. And that sounds so much pretty when the reality is I'm really just describing what the item does. So I think like that kind of understanding of linguistics, and playing with it in that way make me a more graceful writer in your words, which thank you for that. Because they're almost like a plaything, right? Words become like my Legos to build language in that way. Yeah.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Thank you. All right, next question. How do you handle stories that might hurt people still alive?
Couple of different ways. One, the easiest way is just to change names, right? Just change names. Sometimes I like to take the same names but switch up who they are in the story if I feel like one person can handle that story better than another. But typically it's just give them a brand new name. Sometimes it's taking myself out of the story entirely and putting it in the perspective of someone else in the scene or something else in the scene. So maybe it's a bird watching through the window as this thing takes place with these two new characters that I've named. That's a really great way to go about it. I would also say, same thing for being hurt. If it's a space that you can have an honest conversation with the person about the hurt they caused, I would always push you for the resolution of that. And I know by saying that that's not always a possible thing, right? But I think that when you sit to write memoir, what you are saying is I open myself up to re-examine the memories, to think about the choices that I've made, to think about the choices that I didn't and why I didn't make them or what the consequences and blessings were with making those choices. And so I think it's okay to have it as an arrival point that maybe you didn't get everything right. I think it's definitely okay, I think, to interrogate yourself that way. But again, if that's not healthy for you, I think being able to just put some distance between the two of you. I think also that's where fiction really served me well in this piece, is that I could create a dragon, a literal dragon, right? A two-headed monster that I fought, that I knew it represented the person. And the person I was writing about probably does too. But who's going to come out and say, I was the two-headed dragon you were talking about in your book? Why did you write about me? Right? It's probably not going to happen. Most people are not going to want to own the hurt that they've caused. So it was a really great way of navigating maybe some of the more difficult things and difficult topics.
Thank you. Next question. You had mentioned the fine line between the factual versus truth. At what point did you decide to call your work a memoir versus creative nonfiction or another genre?
I did not decide to call it that, which is like one of the questions you Sam and I talked about, which is the publisher actually decided to call it a memoir. And I said, okay, as long as you can sell it, baby. No, but it was a thing of saying, like, I don't think this lives as fiction, because fiction would discount the truth of the stories that I tell you that are honest. And it can't live as nonfiction straight up and down, because there also are parts that are fictionalized. So memoir was this really great space to kind of bend the line. If it's about memory, which is what memoir is, right? Then memory can serve as this very malleable place where truth can bend a little bit more, which I'm grateful that we kind of landed on memoir. And I think that it's probably the only genre that really makes sense. Also, because so many things are being written in verse these days, right? We have novels in verse, we have, poetry collections, we have, children's books in verse. I think being able to have poetry that blends into memoir makes sense. So it really was an opportunity for the people at Henry Holt and myself to kind of defy the form of memoir, and still hold truth to so much of the form of memoir.
Thank you. So I'm going to give folks a little bit of time to ask any lingering questions, but I will ask a question of you. So I'm wondering if there were any sections or particular myths that you found more challenging to write than the others.
Yeah, I think let me think. There definitely were ones that were more difficult. The opening myth, the women who were blind, which talks about how we got eyes in the back of our head. It was a lot harder because, one, it was the first one I was trying to write. Two, it talks about the goddess Yemiya, which comes out of an African deity, or Narisha. I was raised Christian. So to like blend that in as a part of, I'm gonna reclaim that. I was like, whew, my parents might not like this one, So there was like that other voice in my head, I think, that's like, what will society think? What will the people around you think? The people who know you deeply think when they start to see all of the inner workings of how you've processed the world. So that one was a little bit harder for me. It also is the one that people say is horror. And I'm like, I don't know that it's horror, but it's dark, So being able to, I typically present as a fairly happy, bubbly person. And I think it's because I write out all of the really painful stuff, So also spending time in that darker space for a longer time was a little bit harder. But I think it's worthwhile, and I think it definitely landed on something I'm super proud of.
Thank you. So next question. Memoir is so vulnerable. How do you decide what stories are worth telling?
So I tell people that I mentor all the time to write drunk and to edit sober, right? You write it all out, spew all your guts on the page, and then you go back to it and decide, what are the stories that I feel like other people need to take part in? Because the truth is, there's a lot of stories that are just your stories, right? And that maybe aren't the conversations you want to have when you're doing a book talk. Because as an author, that's the reality. Anything you put in print, someone can ask you about, someone can dive into, someone can try to pull up your past or find out who you're talking about. And if you're not willing to confront that, then maybe it's a story that's a worthwhile story, but it's not a story that's worthwhile to share. And there's a really thin line between that. And only you know where that line is. I would also say, as a performance poet, if you've ever heard spoken word, poetry slam, we are notorious oversharers. So for me, that was a little bit less vulnerability, because for probably about 15 years of my life, I lived on stage writing poems about the hardest parts of my life, I remember reciting a poem about having a miscarriage while I was 5 months pregnant with my next child, and being on stage knowing that the child in my stomach could not be there at any moment. And I was talking about the loss of another child, and it was wildly painful. And it also was the only way that I knew how to process that moment. right, was to be in community and to be in a room full of other writers and to say it out loud and make it real, or I was never going to deal with it. So there is a part of writing, I think, that's always been catharsis for me. And I think that's where the vulnerability becomes less of a scary place and more of a place that gives me the freedom to reckon with the things that maybe I want to shy away from. So that's what I said to you, is like, write the really scary thing, run right into it. And you may have to write it 17 times, 17 different ways to land on the part that you feel like sharing. And that part may be one line, right? It may not be the whole story, but it's still a worthwhile exercise if it means that you're taking the time to process the memory and to access that part of your heart that maybe you've locked off for the sake of protecting yourself.
Absolutely. And it doesn't look like we have any other questions in the chat box or the Q&A. So we're going to end here, but thank you so much, Deborah, for your vulnerability and your insights and for sharing everything tonight and for writing this book. It is so wonderful. And I'm so glad that we got to talk about it today.
Anytime, y'all get your copies of Black Chameleon.
Definitely. So everyone in the audience, thank you so much for being here. But we hope that you will click the link in the chat box that I will add in just a second to purchase this book if you haven't already, and to also support Book People. So thank you to Book People for partnering with us for this wonderful event. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. Oh, look. And then I didn't even put the link in the chat. Evan put it in there for me. So thank you all so much. Have a great night.
You too. Talk to you soon, Sam.